Well, welcome to today's presentation, and we're going to talk about Wisconsin POW camps. But when I would like to get started here by simply recognizing this individual, Vaughn Drake Jr. There are only supposedly about 12 known survivors of Pearl Harbor, and this gentleman is supposedly the last known American survivor of Pearl Harbor. He was 23 at the time. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was in his barracks getting ready for breakfast, and they heard the bombs going off. They thought it was just a drill training session until they saw the planes flying by with the rising red sun on the side of the plane and realized they were under attack. He survived that and went on to fight in the war. He just passed away on April 7th of 2025 at the age of 106. Now, interestingly, just the other day I was at the Renaissance Senior Living in Madison, and somebody told me that they had a resident living there who was 13 years old and at Pearl Harbor at the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which would put her somewhere around 96 years old. So, let's get started, and we'll, I'm sorry, yeah?
What does the 12, 23, and 106 stand for?
I'm sorry?
Oh, what does the 12, 23, and 106 stand for? That you had on the...
Well, there are only 12 survivors, and he was 23 when this happened, and he was in Pearl Harbor. All right? All right, so we're going to talk about World War II prisoners of war. And I'll start with an overview of U.S. POWs and POW camps. I'm going to present 5 questions, and I'll address those during the presentation. And those 5 questions are, why did the POWs come to the U.S.? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Where did they go once they arrived? And what happened to them when the war ended? And then we'll talk about Wisconsin POW camps. Most people are not aware of the fact that Wisconsin had POW camps during World War II, and are then surprised to find out we actually had 38 of them, housing up to 20,000 POWs. But I'm going to start with this question because I got asked this question very often. How did you get interested in POWs? So let's start there. It all began with this wooden crate. And you say, well, how can a wooden crate get you interested in POWs? So let me tell you the story about this crate. I found this crate at a garage sale here in the Oregon area. It looked pretty good. It was looked old, looked a little beat up, but not too bad. So I took it home and I began to look at it and clean it up. And on one end I saw a leather patch with a couple of nails in it. And upon closer inspection, I saw embossed lettering that said packing list. And there was kind of a bulge to this patch. So my curiosity was raised, and I thought, well, is there really something underneath there or not? So I looked underneath, and sure enough, there was a small manila envelope labeled packing list. When I opened that, I saw a sheet of yellow paper inside, not colored from age, but actually colored yellow. And it appeared to be in pristine condition. It wasn't dry or crumbly or smeared. It looked like somebody had put that piece of paper in there just the day before. When I began to look more closely at this, I noticed in the upper right-hand corner the date 1/24/46. That told me if this date on this paper was related to that box is around 79 years old. I also then noticed that it came from Camp Swift in Texas, and it went to the United States Armed Forces Institute, which was located at 102 North Hamilton Street, Madison. When I looked at the sheet, there was an inventory of what appeared to have been in the box, and this appeared to be the materials that the military officers were using for training, and they were training the GIs coming out of the service following the war and transitioning into civilian life. Well, it's not unusual to find an artifact at a garage sale. What is unusual is to find an artifact that actually has an attached written history or documentation of that artifact. So this paperwork here told us when this happened, 1946, where it came from, Camp Swift, and where it went to, the Armed Forces Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, and what was contained within that box. There's actually a second envelope with even more paperwork listing more items that were in the box, which appeared to be pamphlets and flyers that they actually gave to those transitioning into civilian life. Now, I learned some things about this box in this research, but there are questions that I never could answer and probably never will be able to answer. The first is, where has this box been for 78 years? We know where it came from, we know where it went, but where has it been since then? And what was it used for? And then how did this box end up in a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin? And then lastly, did anybody else look under that patch to see if there actually was something there or not? I find it hard to believe that that patch stayed intact for 79 years and nobody else looked to see if there was anything there. Well, in my research of this then, we talked about it came from Camp Swift, and I wanted to know a little bit about Camp Swift. This is what Camp Swift looked like back in 1941. Camp Swift is located outside of Bastrop, Texas, which is just outside of Austin. The camp was built in 1941 on 56,000 acres of land, and it had 2,800 buildings, none of which exist today. It was commissioned in May of 1942. It was built in 120 days at a cost of $25 million. It would house up to 90,000 GIs, making it one of the largest training and transshipment camps in Texas. It would train over 300,000 GIs during the war. It still exists today, but it is only about 1/5 of its original size. And today it is the National Arms Training Center and the National Guard Training Center. And during World War II, it housed up to 10,000 German POWs. Here's where I got interested in POWs. And I thought, well, if Camp Swift had POWs, what about Fort McCoy here in Wisconsin? So I had to look into that, and sure enough, they also had POWs. And that just led into more research and more interesting information. So we're going to start by talking about the consequences of war. And those consequences are destruction, death, and POWs. If we take into consideration the homes, the businesses, the industry and infrastructure that was destroyed in Britain, Europe, Russia, Japan, it would come to trillions and trillions of dollars. War always brings death, and we will never know the true number of people who actually die. World War II ran from September of 1939 to September of 1945. And the estimated number of deaths are 21 to 25 million military deaths, 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, 5 to 6 million Holocaust deaths, for a total of somewhere between 70 and 85 million people perished during World War II. And during this time, Russia would have 1,000 or more POW camps. Now, the POWs that we had here in the US, we treated them very humanely, and we followed the Geneva Convention. But that was not the case for Russia, Germany, or Japan. If you were a Russian, you did not want to be a German POW. There will be some 6 million Russian POWs. 3 million will not survive captivity. and they will die from starvation, exposure, illness, forced hard labor, and death marches. But likewise, if you are a German, you didn't want to end up in a Russian POW camp. There will be some 3 million German POWs, 1 million will not survive captivity. And they will die from pretty much the same causes. If you are a German POW, you are sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, and you will serve that hard labor during and after the war. Most of the German POWs are released in 1950. Remember, the war ends in 1945. The last of the German POWs are released in 1956. Likewise, if you're an American, you did not want to be a Japanese POW. There'll be some 27,000 American POWs in Japan. 40%, or 10,800, will not survive captivity. The Japanese have their battlefield code of conduct, which says you will fight to the death. And they not only hold that expectation for themselves, but for you and your country as well. And if you do not die in that war, then you are not worth anything more than hard labor. And if you cannot perform that hard labor, you are not worth anything at all. And the causes of death will be pretty much the same. They add a few things here, like cruelty and physical abuse and starvation. All of these countries will have death marches, particularly as we get closer to the end of the war. Perhaps the most infamous of the death marches is the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. Japan attacks the US in Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. On December 8th of 1941, they attack the Philippines and essentially wipe out the US Air Forces. But unlike Pearl Harbor, they follow this attack with a land assault and a blockade around the island. The American forces will fight with the Japanese for 3 months. They will run out of supplies and food and reach a point of starvation and surrender. The Japanese will capture 75,000 American and Allied forces. They will then force them to march 65 miles from the one end of the island to inward into the railroad depot. They will load them into boxcars and then ship them off to concentration camps. During the march, they will have no food, little or no water. They will be abused and tortured. Once they reach the boxcars, they now have to deal with disease and illness. They're putting 100 POWs in boxcars meant to hold 40. Between the march and the disease and the abuse, up to 650 Americans do not survive that march, and up to 16,500 Philippines do not survive that march. This is an interesting statistic that I found. There were 142,227 American POWs combined for World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. That number is relatively small compared to 6 million Russians and 3 million Germans. And of those, 1,929 were Wisconsinites, and of those, 15,190 did not survive captivity. And the interesting number is at the bottom. 3/4 of that number died at the hands of the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese were quite vicious and mean to their POWs. Well, this is a little aside. If you are interested in World War II and the German concentration camps, you might find this book interesting to read, called Tailspin. It was written by John Armbruster, who is a teacher in Gay Mills, Wisconsin. And he'd heard about this gentleman, Jean Moran from Soldiers Grove, who was in World War II and survived the war. At that time, Jean Moran was a 19-year-old tail gunner on a flying fortress. And one of his missions over Germany, his plane is shot down. The tail section separates. He's in the tail section and falls 4.5 miles down to the earth, crashing into a tree and hitting the ground, and he survives. He's captured. He serves 18 months as a POW in a German POW camp, and he then survives a 600-mile death march. Yeah, fascinating story, and it's interesting that, somebody right here from Wisconsin. It's an interesting book if you're interested in reading that. Well, U.S. declares war against Germany in September of 1941. On December 7th of 1941, Japan attacks at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. declares war on Japan the next day, December 8th, 1941. Up until this point, Britain is holding all POWs from the European front. They are running out of room. The U.S. then declares and says we will take all POWs beginning in early 1942, regardless of where they come from, whether it's Europe, Africa, or Japan. The way we would get these POWs is we would send our ships over with our supplies and our military, and we'd bring back the injured and the POWs. When they came here, they would go to one of 511 area camps or 175 branch camps. The area camps were existing civilian conservation corps camps or military bases. And these were used because they already had the infrastructure, the security, and the barracks to house these POWs. Initially, the thought was we would build these POW camps overseas, but that presented problems. We'd have to take all the materials there to build the barracks and the infrastructure, and that would be costly to do. But even more costly would be the fact that we would have to sacrifice military to stay there to guard these camps, and we sorely needed them on the war front. So it was decided we would bring the POWs here. We'd have to worry about revolt, mutinies, escapes. That could happen whether here or over there, but much easier to control here. And then lastly, if they were overseas, we'd have to be concerned about attacks on those POW camps in an effort to release those prisoners so they could go back and fight the war again. So again, it was decided they would come here. The government wanted to eliminate or minimize the intermingling and interaction between the POWs and civilians for a number of reasons, and we'll get into some of those a little bit later. And you're going to also find out that they didn't necessarily do a very good job of that. During this time, there would be 2,287 escapes from the POW camps. Most of those would be very short-lived, and they'd be captured within a matter of 24 to 48 hours, although a few did go longer than that, maybe even weeks or months. But to my knowledge, no POW ever escaped from a US POW camp and made it back to their home country. But I'm going to tell you the story of the greatest POW escape in the US. And this is called I call it the Great Arizona POW Escape. And this happened at Camp Papago Park outside of Phoenix, Arizona. At this camp, there were a large number of German naval POWs. And I always find it ironic that these men who probably spent their life on the water get sent to a desert POW camp. But they didn't have work there for these POWs like we did here in Wisconsin. And so the POWs asked if they could have some tools to build a volleyball court. And the camp commander thought, well, that'd be fine. It'll keep them busy, and once they have it, it'll give them some recreation activity. So he provided them the tools to build their volleyball court. And they put those tools to good use. And on December 23rd of 1944, 25 of those POWs escaped through a 178-foot tunnel. going under 2 of the camp fences and under a service road and coming out on the side of a canal. 3 of the Germans thought they would build a canoe and take the canoe with them, and they did. And they would then walk 30 miles to the Gila River. They would float down the Gila River to the Colorado, and then from the Colorado down to the Mexican border. The only problem was when they got to the river, they forgot they were in a desert and there was no water in the river. So they had to abandon their canoe and head out into the desert. About a half a dozen realized they were going to be in pretty severe conditions and they simply surrendered. The other 19 were eventually captured, although 2 of them did get within 10 miles of the Mexican border. Here on the left, you can see the entrance to that escape tunnel. It dropped down 6 feet and then went 178 feet under the ground. It was located behind the kitchen mess hall. On the right is the newspaper article telling about this great escape. These are the 19 that they were still looking for that are all eventually captured. And notice the reward is $25. I just saw the other day that a dozen or 10 or 12 that escaped in Louisiana, the bounty on that was $20,000. Quite a jump in from World War II. Well, we don't have any POW camps today, and you would have no idea that there may have even been a POW camp there, especially for branch camps like we had in Wisconsin, because many of them were not around for very long, just a couple of months for the harvesting and canning seasons. But here on the right here, you can see the plaque that sits right over the top of where that escape tunnel entrance was. Camp Papago still exists today, but it's nothing but a few administrative buildings. As I mentioned, the branch camps have generally no markings. One of the exceptions is over here on the left, Camp Reedsburg. The plaque tells a little bit about the war and about Camp Reedsburg. One of my neighbors down the street grew up in Reedsburg and never knew they had a POW camp until she came to one of the presentations. Well, every state had POW camps except for Hawaii, Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. California had the most with 110. Texas was next with 80. Wisconsin had 38. If we look at a map of the United States, you can see how these camps were spread out throughout the United States. They tended to be concentrated to the south because it was cheaper to build tent encampments than wooden barracks, and it was cheaper to heat those camps than it would be those up north. If we add to this military medical facilities that housed POWs, the U.S. would have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 locations housing POWs. The U.S. will have in excess of 425,000 POWs, consisting mostly of German, Italian, and Japanese. We talked about those huge numbers that don't survive captivity in Russia, Germany, and Japan. In the U.S., a total of 477 do not survive captivity, but they die from 265 natural causes, 72 suicides, 43 traffic accidents, and 17 drownings. There are 14 POWs are found guilty of murder of another POW. They are tried and hung. To my knowledge, no POW was ever killed by the military. So let's switch now to Wisconsin POW camps. This information is based on this book called Stalag, Wisconsin, Inside World War II Prisoner of War Camps by Betty Colley. Betty Colley was a history teacher in Altoona, Wisconsin, which is basically a suburb of Eau Claire. And her students would not believe her when she told them that Altoona once housed POWs. Upon retirement, she then began to research to write her book. Information was difficult to come by. The information on the branch camps in the National Archives were destroyed in the 1950s. papers would censor any stories about the war, POWs, or POW camps. But she managed to dig up some information, and then she also talked to over 300 people that were either a POW, worked with a POW, or lived in a community that had a POW camp. The first camp that we had in Wisconsin, and the largest, was Camp McCoy. The POW camp was located within Camp McCoy, and I was a little confused initially when I was doing this, because I thought, what was Camp McCoy and then Fort McCoy? And it was always Camp McCoy until the 1970s, when it was recommissioned and renamed Fort McCoy. So the POW camp exists within Camp McCoy. It's a 20-acre site surrounded by a double 8-foot cyclone fence. It had guard towers, guards, and guard dogs. The camp would consist of 30 to 35 buildings, consisting of kitchen and mess halls, showers, and barracks. The POWs will do their own cooking. They will do their own cleaning and maintenance of the grounds, the mess hall, and their barracks. They will do their own laundry. The camp is essentially self-sufficient. This is a rendering of Camp McCoy drawn by a German POW in 1943, and it's a pretty good rendering of what the camp may have looked like. The camp opens early in 1942 for POWs. It already exists, and it is serving as an internment camp for any Germans, Italians, or Japanese thought to be a threat to the US. You're probably most familiar with the Japanese internment camps in California, where entire Japanese families were sent to these internment camps for the duration of the war. But the first POWs began to arrive in 1942. The camp will remain open until 1946, when it closes and the POWs are sent home. It will hold up to 5,000 German POWs, 3,500 Japanese POWs, and 500 Korean POWs. Kind of wondered, where did these Koreans come from? And we'll find out here in just a minute. This is Ensign Sakamaki. Ensign Sakamaki was one of 10 naval officers selected, not volunteered, selected to do a suicide mission at Pearl Harbor in 5 two-man mini-subs. They will attack on December 7th of 1941. 4 of those 5 submarines will be sunk. Only 1 will make it into the harbor. 9 of those 10 POW or Navy officers will not survive the attack. Sakamaki's mini-sub has all kinds of problems from the minute it launches from the mother sub, and I won't go into the complete story on that, but it eventually ends up on a coral reef. Sakamaki attempts to sabotage his sub with explosives. They fail to go off. His crewmate will drown. He is found the next morning on December 8th by a US soldier on beach patrol, unconscious, and he is captured, and he becomes US POW number 1. He is the first POW to be captured. He will then make his way to the US, and he will arrive at Camp McCoy on March 9th of 1942, and he will serve the duration of the war in a POW camp. He was 22 or 23 years old, and he fought in the war for 1 day. And interestingly enough, in another presentation that I'll be doing a little bit later, he will eventually be released and return to his home country. He will come to a conference in Fredericksburg, Texas, about the war in 1999, and he will see his mini-sub for the first time in 50 years. His mini-sub is then recovered, and it is brought to the US. It will tour the country in an effort to raise war bonds. It will travel through 41 states and 2,200 villages and cities in that effort to raise war bonds. During the war, there were 8 war bond drives. President Franklin Roosevelt buys the very first war bond. Those 8 drives will raise a total of $185.7 billion, which will pay for more than half the cost of the war, which was around $300 billion. Today, we may get a few aircraft carriers for that. Well, they found that these POWs tended to be territorial. That is, the Germans stuck together in a group, as did the Japanese, as did the Koreans, and they did not get along with each other. But even within nationalities, they would not get along. So the Nazis would not get along with the non-Nazis. The Nazis would be the party members. The non-Nazis are not party members, but conscripted into the service to fight the war. The Nazis will intimidate, harass, and even kill the non-Nazis. While the Japanese Navy and Army POWs are dedicated to the Emperor, they don't get along with each other. The Army blames the Navy for not doing a sufficient job of blockading the island and keeping the Americans away from attack. And there are more Navy POWs than Army, so they tend to control the camp. Here's where the Koreans come in. The Koreans are seeking revenge against the Japanese. At the beginning of the war, Japan will attack many of the Southeast Asian countries, including Korea, and they will conquer Korea and force the military to fight the war for Japan. They will also find out that the Japanese tend to be suicidal because of that code of conduct, which says you do nothing to help the enemy and you fight to the death. And they will have 5 Japanese suicides at Camp McCoy. Ensign Sakamaki will attempt suicide 4 times and survive. Unlike the German POWs who were allowed to go to the branch camps to work, the Japanese were never allowed to leave Camp McCoy. Because of that code of conduct, there was always concern about what they might do if they were to escape in terms of fighting and attacking civilians. So they were never allowed to leave the camp to work. That doesn't mean they didn't work. They simply did their work within the camp. But we would have 14 Japanese escapes and 4 German escapes from Camp McCoy. They'd all be caught within a relatively short time. It didn't make a whole lot of sense for them to escape. They didn't know the language. They didn't know the land. They had no means of transportation. They had no money. And they had prison garb with a big letter PW on the front and the back. They would stand out quite clearly. Most of them simply accepted their fate and awaited their return to their home country. One German POW said, if I'd known we were going to have such luxury conditions to live in, with beds, with mattresses, pillows, and blankets, I would have surrendered a whole lot sooner, versus sleeping on the top of my tank and fighting until we ran out of ammunition. Another one said, if you were given an opportunity to escape, would you? He said, no. He said, this is heaven. He said, compared to what we would suffer in our home country. They had it good and they knew it. They had shelter, they had food, they had clothing, they had the opportunity to work and make money. They had recreation and entertainment. Life was not bad for these people in the POW camps. And they certainly didn't have to worry about a bomb falling on them or somebody shooting at them. Well, here are the branch camps. They range from Antigo to Hortonville and Janesville to Wisconsin Rapids. I'll come back to this slide at the end of the presentation so you can see if you may have lived, worked, or grew up in an area that may have had a POW camp. If we look at a map of Wisconsin, you can see how these camps are spread around the state. 15 of these camps opened in June of 1944. The last camp opens is Camp Ashland, which opens in August of 1945. The smallest POW camp is Camp Bayfield with 125 POWs. The 2 largest branch camps are Camp Billy Mitchell, which you know today as Mitchell International Airfield with 3,000 POWs, and Camp Sturgeon Bay with 2,140 POWs. The two shortest run camps are Camp Jefferson and Camp Lake Kesis, which are only open for 1 month, from June to July of 1944. The two longest running continuous branch camps are Camp Heartland and Camp Rockfield, which are open for 12 and 18 consecutive months. We could use the POWs for labor following the 1929 Geneva Convention and Red Cross Accords. That labor could not be war-related. We could not force the POW officers to work, and if they work, they must be compensated. So they were paid at a rate of 80 cents a day in the form of camp script, which could only be used at the camp canteen. But in addition to that, they will receive 10 cents a day in gratuity pay. That money will be collected and accumulated, and at the end of the war, they will be given that in the form of cash to take with them when they return to their home country. Businesses that would employ POWs will pay the going hourly wage rate. So if they are paying their employees 40 cents an hour, that is what they will pay for the POW labor. And based on this POW labor, the government will earn somewhere around $360 million, which will more than offset the cost of the POW camps and help offset the cost of the war. The type of work they would do would be harvesting. I'm not a big vegetable eater, and so I was kind of surprised to realize that we actually grew all these crops in Wisconsin, but we did. They would pick at orchards. They would be doing lumbering, dairy, farming, canneries, industrial factories, and tanneries. Pretty much anywhere where you may have found a labor shortage, you may have found POWs working. And where did they stay? They would stay at fairgrounds and the associated buildings, tent encampments, farms, cannery property, military bases, and government buildings. Here pictured is Camp Bayfield, which was the Bayfield County Courthouse and community building. The POWs will sleep on the gym floor up on the upper level. They will take their showers in the basement. The main floor will serve as the kitchen and the mess hall. Security consisted of 2 guard stations out front, front of the building, and a picket fence around the back of the building to keep the civilians out of the building. On the upper left here is Camp Reedsburg, which was a tent encampment. The bottom is Camp Plymouth, which was at the fairgrounds. The POWs would be staying in this wooden building. The tent will serve as their kitchen and their mess hall. Now, while Camp McCoy had the most security with the double fence, guard towers, and guards and guard dogs, many of the branch camps may have some security, but not nearly as much as Camp McCoy. Some of them would not have any security whatsoever. They would all, however, have military guards. Camp Reedsburg actually had no security around it until the editor of the local paper wrote an editorial complaining about the lack of security. So they went about to make sure that they secured this camp, and they surrounded the boundaries of the camp with a picket fence. Now, the purpose of the picket fence was not to prevent the POWs from escaping. The purpose of the fence was to keep the civilians out of the camp. Here's just another example. This is Camp Rockfield. On the left would be a guard station versus a guard tower. It was a tent encampment. It actually even had a banner over the camp. This is the one that stayed open the longest for 18 continuous months. Well, here's Camp Hartford, which was in Hartford, Wisconsin, and it was at the Swartz Ballroom. And this is where the big bands would come, like Lawrence Welk and Benny Goodman and so forth. It was quite a fancy ballroom. It was 120 feet across. It had a ceiling 65 feet high. It had a 16-foot, 2-ton chandelier hanging in it. Quite fancy for the time. This camp would be open year-round because in addition to annual crops or seasonal crops, they had annual work such as dairy farms, milk and cheese processing plants, and other manufacturing work for the POWs. This camp, like many of them, will harvest hemp for rope. Wisconsin will be one of the largest hemp growers during World War II, and some of that wild hemp still grows today. Interesting story here. There was a local farmer who would come and pick up the waste food from this camp and take it back home to feed to his pigs. He will go to the camp commander and complain that they are wasting too much food. So the camp commander solves that and gets rid of the farmer. He goes out and buys 10 little piglets, and he brings them back and feeds the waste food to them. And when the pigs get big, he feeds them to the POWs. In 1945, this camp will make $250,182 for the government on POW labor. And following the war, the big bands will never come back to the Swartz Ballroom. Well, let's talk about some of the branch camps. We'll start with Camp Antigo. The POWs would often work out at a farm, and during a lunch break, the farmers would offer them corn to eat, and they would refuse to eat it because they would say that is swine food. That would happen at a number of different locations, but at one of them they actually buttered and salted the corn and gave it to the POWs. They ate it and they liked it, and they asked if they could have some of that dried corn seed to take with them when they returned to their home country. Now, I could relate to this story because my father-in-law was of German descent. He grew up on a farm here in Wisconsin. And anytime we would have corn, he would refuse to eat it because he said that is what we use to fatten the pigs. So I could relate to the story. Again, jump over, Billy Mitchell will come back to that. Camp Cobb. There was a POW German barber, and he gave free haircuts to all the POWs and the military guards until the local barber complained to the commander that he was losing business and money. So thereafter, the guards could no longer get free haircuts. But the barber didn't make any money. The guards were so upset about the fact they couldn't get free haircuts, they went to the next town to get their hair cut. There was a 14-year-old here working in a hemp field. He's approached by a POW who says, "Why aren't you in the military fighting the war?" And he says, "Well, I am only 14. The POW said, "Well, I'm 16. In the reading here, I saw the age of the POWs range from about 14 to 65. Essentially, Germany was using all the men available to fight the war. Camp Fond du Lac was at the fairgrounds in Fond du Lac. The military liked their beer, and so do the POWs. And after the camp opens, the beer distributor shows up and drops off 25 cases of beer, and we will make beer deliveries every other day thereafter. They had an escape here. One of the POWs did not return with his work crew. They put out the alarm to the community, again panicking the community. They begin the search for this POW. They find him 2 hours later in a local bar having a beer. And while this story was printed here for Fond du Lac, I'm sure it happened in more occasions than just Fond du Lac. One U.S. woman becomes pregnant via a POW. There was some of that intermingling going on that the government was trying to prevent. Camp Fox Lake. Here the POWs are playing tricks on the guards. The POWs would be given matches to light their cigarettes. They would collect those match heads over a period of time, and they had a large metal box that they would stuff full of these match heads. One night they will sneak out, they'll put this box onto a small hill, they'll light a fuse, and the box explodes with a bang, and the guards panic and immediately begin firing and shooting at the box, and the POWs are all standing outside their tents laughing hilariously. So they are punished and they are given half rations for a week. But that didn't stop the POWs. On one mission they were out cutting down a tree, and when they started cleaning up the branches, they realized the tree had fallen on a large skunk and killed the skunk. So they dug a hole and they buried the skunk. They put a wooden cross on the ground, and they stood around with their heads bowed. The guards panicked, thinking they had buried a POW. They grabbed their shovels and began to frantically dig and find the skunk. And the POWs are again laughing hilariously. They are again punished with half rations for a week. But the guards get their revenge. The Germans liked to grow their hair longer, and they would comb and groom their hair. And they didn't have hair creams at the POW camps. But one of them said, well, you know, back home, the hair creams would have birch sap in it. So they found a birch tree, they collected some of the sap, they put it in their hair, and it worked really well for grooming and combing their hair until it dried. And then it looked like a helmet on their head. So the guards took care of that by simply shaving all of their heads. Camp Fredonia. This is a new culture for the Germans. The language, the land, and what was going on. And one of those new culture things was food. They will taste foods that they've never seen before, and one of those is Jell-O, which they liked. Another one is German potato salad. They will sometimes go out to a restaurant, and for dessert, one of their favorite desserts would be apple pie. Camp Galesville. It's a pretty interesting story. Staff Sergeant Cram is one of 18 of 287 in his unit to survive the Battle of the Bulge. He is captured, and he is a German POW. He escapes, and he's captured by the American forces. He has to convince them that he actually is an American, and he does. He is down to 60 pounds. He begins his recovery overseas, and he's brought back to the U.S. to a military medical facility in Chicago. He is granted a leave of absence, and he goes to his hometown of Galesville. He spends the first couple of days at home recovering, and then decides he's going to go out to one of his old hangouts called the Coffee Cup. He walks into the Coffee Cup, and he's astonished to see German POWs drinking beer and having a good time. And the guards have their rifles leaning against the wall, joining them and having a good time as well. He is furious. He rushes home, he grabs his Winchester rifle, goes back to the Coffee Cup, orders all of the civilians out. He lines up the POWs and the military guard, marches them all back to camp. The camp commander gets things settled down. Staff Sergeant Cram goes back to Chicago, and thereon after, the POWs are never again allowed in downtown Galesville. Camp Green Lake, another really interesting story. This camp was located on the Lawson Farm. You might know it today as the Lawsonia Golf Course, one of the top golf courses in the Midwest. I have a brother-in-law that lives in Princeton, which is not far from Green Lake, and he said, that's what those stone towers are. They built their guard towers out of stone, and those stones still stand there today. In this one, there was a German immigrant family in Milwaukee. They owned and operated the Deutschland Dairy. The mother decides to take the 16-year-old son and the baby daughter back to Germany to visit with the grandparents. When they get to Germany, the Germans confiscate the 16-year-old's passport and graft him into the military. He ends up becoming a paratrooper. He jumps into the war over Cyprus, and shortly thereafter he surrenders to the Allied forces. He's sent back to the US, and he goes to Camp Green Lake. He tries to convince the military that he is a US citizen, and they tend to believe that he is, but they treat him as a POW, using him as an interpreter for the POWs and the military. At the end of the war, they do not release him. They repatriate him back to Germany, where he then has to apply for a visa, which he does. He eventually is granted the visa and returns to the US. Camp Hortonville. There is a sauerkraut factory in Bear Creek, Wisconsin. It's still there today. The holding company for this factory just announced a $12 million addition, and they will be establishing their headquarters in Madison, Wisconsin. There was a 17-year-old here who drove a school bus, and he would pick up the POWs, take them to the factory, and then bring them back at the end of the day. And when he picked up the POWs, they would get on the bus, followed by a single military guard. And when the guard got onto the bus, he would take his rifle and throw it to one of the POWs and sit up front and talk to the 17-year-old driver. Well, that kind of concerned the POW until after a while he finally figured out that rifle never had any ammunition in it. There's another story here where, again, a bus is picking up a load of POWs. They head back, they get a short distance down the road and realize that they are missing one of the POWs. So they turn the bus around to go back and pick him up. And here he is running up the road trying to catch up to the bus. Obviously, he didn't want to have to walk all the way back to camp, and he was probably concerned about missing his supper. But these two stories kind of give you an idea that if they really wanted to escape, they had plenty of opportunities to do so. Camp Janesville, this was located on the southwest corner of Janesville. It was a 10-acre site surrounded by a double barbed wire fence. They even had guard towers on each end of the camp. One story here was there was a truck taking 17 POWs to a work site. It's involved in a traffic accident. The truck rolls over. 9 of the POWs are hospitalized. No Americans are injured, and the only American involved was the guard driving the truck. The POWs that would be at the branch camps, they would all be primarily German POWs, and they would come from one of 2 base camps. It'd either come from Camp McCoy or they'd come from Camp Sheridan, which was located just north of Chicago. If they were working in a cannery and they were on the grounds of the cannery, they would just walk to work. If they were, say, within a mile or so of the cannery or the place that they were going to work, they would just march them. If they went to the cannery, in some cases, the military guards would stay there all day. In other cases, they would drop them off and go to the local bar and spend the day in the bar. If they were going to a farm and they were taking a large number of them, they would truck them to the farm. The military guards would go with them and remain there, and in many cases actually work with the POWs. But if it was a farmer and he only needed a small number, they would just drive to the POW camp, pick up the POWs, take them to the farm, use them for the day, and then return them. One farmer said, you know, the roads between my farm and your camp are so bad, can I just take them for a week? And they went, okay. So he converted his garage into a barracks, and the POWs would stay for a week at a time. Here the story is there's a farmer who only needed 3 POWs, so he goes to the camp, he picks up the 3 POWs, takes them back to the farm. They do their work for the morning, and then he needs to get them to another farm to finish up the day. So he has his daughter drive those POWs to the other farm. Now, life is a whole lot simpler than in 1945 than it is today, but kids get involved in farm life at a pretty early age. So this daughter that drove those 3 POWs actually drove past the state patrol car on the way to the farm, and she was 9 years old. Now, again, it simply tells you the story that if they wanted to attack or assault civilians, they had plenty of opportunities to do so. And again, in my research, I did not ever see a single case of a civilian being assaulted or murdered by a POW. Camp Jefferson, there was a banker who had a stately home on a farm, and he had POWs working there, and he also had a dachshund by the name of Shotzi. And Shotzi would periodically escape from the home and run out to where the POWs were working. And he also had a maid, and the maid would go to the back door and yell, "Shotzi, Shotzi," and the POWs would start hooting and hollering at her, and she didn't know why. And perhaps somebody should have told her that in German, Shotzi meant sweetheart. Camp Lake Kisas. This was perhaps the most posh of all the POW camps. It was considered to be a luxury resort, the Candler Resort. It had a beach with men and women's changing room with showers and a dock. It had a restaurant. It had a dance hall, which is where the POWs would stay, in bunks stacked 4 high, and they'd create quite a bit of wear and damage to the dance floor. One day the military goes into town making the announcement, take shelter, take shelter. We have 2 escaped POWs. Again, everybody is panicking. They then begin the search for these POWs, and they find them within a matter of a couple of hours. The 2 POWs are walking down the county road with 2 of the local girls. It is also said here that the owner's wife would raise chickens and the POWs would steal and eat those chickens. And probably between that and the damage to the dance hall, the resort owner will not renew his contract with the military the next year. Camp Markesan. This is kind of interesting. In 1944, Markesan did not have a camp, but Green Lake did. And the POWs that would work in the canneries around Markesan came from Green Lake. In 1945, it flipped. Markesan had the POW camp, Green Lake did not. And it was reported here that this was a camp where they had a Nazi killing a non-Nazi and stabbing one of the guards. It was never confirmed because the local paper cooperated with military and censored the story. The military considered this an internal affair and that they would take care of it and solve it, which they did, without ever reporting it in the news. But the story came from people who worked at the canneries who said they had heard that a Nazi had killed another POW. And they would also report that the 1944, they said we had a bad batch of German POWs. Well, what they had were Nazis. The Nazis would either refuse to work or would work very slowly or would even attempt to sabotage the plants. In some cases, would actually put the swastika symbol onto the cans that they were packing. And then in their story, they said in 1945, they were much more cooperative. Now they got rid of the Nazis. If they realized it was a Nazi, they would immediately be sent back to one of the base camps and never allowed to go and work again. Markesan is actually one of those towns in which the Sakamaki's mini sub actually went through town. They cut 7 portholes into the side of that mini sub, and for $1 you could look into the mini sub and see what it looked like. That mini sub was 78.5 feet long, and in the one picture that I saw him in 1991, the sub is sitting on the ground and it's barely taller than he is. They called them coffin submarines. And since it was a suicide mission, it obviously was. Camp Sheboygan, when they're looking for, in terms of Markesan, a few of the POWs, if they were considered to be trustworthy, they would be called trustees, and they would be allowed to leave the camp and just wander down to the local bar or maybe to the movie theater. Germany surrenders on May 5th of 1945. That changes everything. The Germans no longer are even thinking about escape. All they're thinking about is, I'm going to go home. The US civilians no longer are panicked about the fact that we have this enemy in our backyard. The military guards everything is relaxed, much more relaxed. And it was not unusual at that point that POWs would be allowed to go into the community and go to the local bar. Camp Billy Mitchell, they would talk about, you'd go to the bars across from the camp and you'd find all kinds of POWs in the bars. So things just changed drastically after that point. Camp Sheboygan, when looking for a location, they decided the abandoned county asylum would work. It was thought to be haunted at that time and is still considered to be haunted. But it was a large facility. It had showers, it had kitchens, it worked quite well. The biggest problem they had there was keeping the teenage girls out of the camp. Here they had one of the stories, they had one of the POWs took a little too long to get out of the outhouse and he missed the bus back to the camp. He was concerned that he maybe would be shot because they thought he was attempting to escape. He knocks on the farm door and said, I missed the bus. And so they contact the camp, and the camp isn't going to send back a bus just for one POW. So they take a new recruit GI, and he's never driven a Jeep before, so he's pretty excited about this and tell him, go pick up the POW. He drives out to the farm. Again, the POW is still worried he's going to be shot until he gets in the Jeep and realizes the military doesn't even have a weapon on him. and he shares his treat that he had just received that day with the POW. Another interesting story here, there's a 12-year-old, and he looks out the window of his home and he sees two strange men walking up the driveway with long coats. He has no idea who they are. There's a knock on the door. His dad answers the door, and it's two POWs, and one of them happens to be his brother. He and his wife had immigrated from Germany, and his brother was fighting in the war for Germany. So they come into the house and they have a conversation in German. The 12-year-old doesn't understand any of this. But after a while, he looks out the window again, and here comes a military guard and two MPs up the driveway. The dad panics, tells his wife to take the two POWs and hide them in the basement. The guard comes up and knocks on the door. Dad answers the door, and the guard says, have you seen two POWs? And he said, no, I haven't seen any POWs. This confuses the guard. He says, well, they were given permission to come and see you. So now he realizes what the situation is, and he admits they're in the basement. He gets them, and they go back to the camp with the guards. Camp Sturgeon Bay. This was actually 7 different locations. The largest was at the Sturgeon Bay Fairgrounds. The other 6 were at orchards scattered throughout the county. They would stay in tents or barracks in which they would normally bring in immigrants to do the picking. And I was quite surprised that at many of these, they mentioned that the immigrants they brought in were Jamaicans. But it is said that the POWs saved the 1945 Door County cherry crop. The combination of those 7 locations picked 508,020 pails of cherries, earning the government $101,604. Camp Waupun. We have a prison there, but we also had a POW camp. And I said this is probably the most scandalous of all the POW stories, but it's an interesting one. They had a German interpreter who was exchanging notes with an American woman who lived in a house adjacent to the camp. And her husband was on active duty and overseas. This exchange of notes escalated into nightly visits, which raised concern of the neighbors, and they called the police. The police investigate and realize that this is not a military guard visiting the American woman, but a POW. He is immediately sent back to Camp Sheridan, and he receives the most serious penalty you could give at that time, which was 14 months of bread and water, followed by 16 months of hard labor. The American woman pleads to adultery and is sentenced to 1 year of probation. Well, here's Camp Billy Mitchell. You can see what it looked like in their barracks, and you can see how the camp was spread out. And again, this had 3,000 POWs. The POWs worked what was at that time the longest battery assembly line for an affiliate of Rayovac, making small batteries for radios. The interesting story here is that they had just received a new batch of German POWs. And that night, 2 of them walk out along the fence until they find a place they can get over the fence, and they head into Milwaukee. They come across the dance hall, and they figured this would be a good place to get a beer. So they go in, and they're surprised at the number of people who speak German, but even more surprised that most of them spoke Polish. And initially, they thought maybe they had escaped in Poland, not in the US. Well, at the same time, the Milwaukee police were looking for 2 individuals that had committed mail fraud. And these 2 looked suspicious. Their heads were bald and their clothing was on inside out. So they arrest them and they interrogate them, and they realize that these are not the individuals they were looking for, but they are actually POWs. So they take them back to Camp Billy Mitchell. The camp didn't know they had even escaped. But as a consequence of that, they ended up having to put a second fence around the camp. They put guard towers at each corner of the camp, and those lights would stay on all night long. Now, when the police left, the POWs thanked them for not shooting them, because that was the expectation, that if you attempted to escape, you would be shot. If you escaped a German POW camp, you would not be shot on sight. You would be taken back to the camp, and all of the POWs would be lined up to watch the execution. so you would know what would happen to you if you attempted to escape. At Camp Billy Mitchell, they would actually publish and print their own newspaper in their own language. They would have a public exhibit of the drawing and artwork done by the POWs. And in the book, it actually shows a woman that has one of those paintings she bought from one of those POWs. In some of the branch camps, the YMCA would actually provide instruments for them, and they would have bands or orchestras, or they may have a choir, and they would perform for the POWs and the military. And the civilians would come and sit outside the camp and enjoy those performances. Or they may go and stand outside the fence and watch these Germans playing this new game they'd never seen before or heard of, which was called soccer. At some of the camps, the troops that were coming in were young Germans from the Rommel African Corps. They would come with tans and their shorts, and all the women thought that they were pretty hot. And this would be the first time that many people would see men wearing shorts. Now, you would think with all these camps that we had, you would find tons and tons and tons of pictures of POW camps, but you don't. Because again, remember, these stories were censored. But there would be some camps where the press would be allowed in to take photographs. So all of these come from Camp Columbus. So on the left, they're at a binary. They're marching to the trucks and being loaded on the truck, lining up outside the camp and washing their clothes on the concrete floor. This is Door County, and again, because we had so many of them, there are a number of pictures here. They're arriving by train, working in the kitchen, working in the fields. Even the guards are helping out. And here you can see a good example of the clothing with the big letter PW on the outside of the clothing. There's Camp Green Lake. They've arrived by train. They're loading the trucks to take them to the camp. In the middle is the Camp Waupun, which was a tent encampment. Camp Appleton, they're outside of a cannery. Camp Hortonville, you can see a diagram of the camp. Camp Lodi was another tent encampment. And here's Camp Fond du Lac, and again, you can see the example of the very secure fencing that they had around these camps. This is an interesting story given to me by somebody after one of the presentations, and I've gotten a number of stories that have been very, very interesting. In the middle here is John Pruss. He was a guard at one of the POW camps, and he asked one of the POWs to carve a boat for his son, and this is the boat that he carved. And his son was Terry Pruss. Well, Terry Pruss is now 82 years old, and he lives in Denver, Colorado. And he still is holding on to this boat, and he thinks this boat really should belong to the Plymouth Historical Society Museum. So he contacts the president of the society, who happened to be in Denver, Colorado at the time. And he said, well, I will be glad to pick that up and take it back so you don't have to ship it. And this boat now sits in their museum. Well, let me finish up here by telling you about the largest German Stalag. Stalag in German is POW camp. This camp ran continuously for 6 years. It held Allied POWs. It is the only German Stalag to never have an escape. You may have seen this Stalag at one point or another on TV. It was Stalag 13. You probably know it as Hogan's Heroes. The main characters are Colonel Klink, Sergeant Schultz, American Colonel Hogan, Frenchman Corporal LeBeau, American Sergeant Kinchlow, and Sergeant Carter, British Corporal Newkirk. The show ran from 1965 to 1971, filming 168 episodes. Colonel Klink and Colonel Hogan are the only two characters that appear in all 168 episodes. If you watch the show, the 4 German officers, Klink, Schultz, General Burkhalter, and Major Hochstetter, were all Jewish. Klink, Schultz, and Burkhalter actually escaped Nazi Germany. Frenchman LeBeau actually survived internment at a German concentration camp. If you watch the show, You would often see General Burkhalter arriving or departing in a vehicle that looks like this. It's a 6-wheel off-road vehicle. This model is a 1938 German Mercedes-Benz Model 31. You will often find photographs or movies of Hitler standing in a vehicle like this during military parades. There are only ever 57 of these made from 1931 to 1939, and only 3 survived the war, and this one ended up on Hogan's Heroes. Well, you can see we've answered 4 of those 5 questions that I started at the beginning of the presentation. The last one is what happened to the POWs after the war ended. You can see based on their experience, they got to know the farmers or some of the families here. They liked the culture, they liked the food, they liked the land. They were fascinated by cows. If you had 2 cows in Germany, you were considered to be wealthy. At one cannery during lunch, they would sit on the steps and watch the 30 cows across the road, and they were fascinated. They would argue amongst themselves who would get to drive the big tractor, because they never saw tractors that big in Germany. So you can see their life was pretty good here. Many of them didn't want to leave, but they were not allowed to stay. They were all repatriated to their home country, the last of them leaving in June of 1946. But they could come back to the US by applying for a visa, and when they did so, they would have to have a sponsor, and that sponsor would have to guarantee they would have a place to reside and a job to work. Maybe we need to apply that policy again today. And many of them did. They would apply for a visa and they did come back. Many of them would eventually bring their families back to introduce them to the farm families they may have worked with or show them where they had been a POW. I want to give you one story of a POW that actually came back, and that is Kurt Peckman. Kurt Peckman was a granite engraver in Germany, and here he is when he arrives at Camp Hartford. He's in the middle row on the end on his camp soccer team. He went to a number of different sites in Wisconsin, branch camps. He is repatriated in 1946. When you're repatriated, you don't go directly to your home country. You will go to France or you will go to Britain, and you are obligated to perform 2 years of service. And he will say that that service in France was much tougher than the service he had here in the US. He completes his 2 years of service. He goes to his hometown in Germany. It is destroyed. There is nothing there. He asked a farmer in Lodi that he got to know if he would sponsor him, and he agrees to do so. He brings his fiancée with him back to the US, and he works for that farmer for 9 months. He then goes to Madison, and he gets a job with the Madison Monument Company. The individual who gives me this story or tells me this story, his dad owns that monument company, or owned it. After several years of working there, Kurt Peckman will buy that from his father, and it becomes the Peckman Memorial Company in Madison, Wisconsin, which still exists today. And it is now operated by his son and his grandson. Now, to show you the effect of the POW camps here, the hope was that if we treated our POWs very humanely, that maybe the Germans would do so as well, which obviously they did not. But because of his treatment, he has dedicated his life, and as his son and grandson, to US military and law enforcement. And they have built many monuments throughout the state of Wisconsin and did the engraving. If we have the unfortunate situation of a law enforcement officer being killed in Wisconsin, they will engrave that name on the law enforcement monument on the Capitol Square at no cost. At another presentation, a woman came up to me, and it doesn't matter where she was from, but she said they were considering building a small veterans monument memorial. And they figured they'd have to start a fundraiser. And she said she decided to just make a cold call to a monument company in Madison, and she just randomly picked Peckman. And she called them and she said, "This is just a cold call. I want to get some information. We want to build a small memorial. I'd like to know the cost." And she said, he cut her off and he said, "What do you need? When do you need it? And it's free." That's their dedication to our military and veterans based on his experience while he was here at a POW. I thought that was a pretty cool story. Here he is actually engraving in Germany, and that's his company today. Well, if you want to know more about POWs, I suggest you get the book Stalag, Wisconsin. It's available through the library and for further enlightenment. I'm going to finish up here with this, and I'll leave this up here for a little bit. And I'll leave this up so if you want to get any information from the two books that I mentioned, it's there. And I'm just going to promote another presentation here real quick. On August 15th of this year, I will be doing a presentation called VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, which is celebrated on August 15th at the Oregon Senior Center. And you're going to learn a whole lot more about Sagamaki and the events that lead up to VJ Day, such as Pearl Harbor, the Janesville 99, which is a tank company out of Janesville that actually participated in the Bataan Death March, and only 35 make it back to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the celebration of VJ Day. So you might find that interesting as well. So I'm going to finish up here. I will be glad to stick around for a little while if people have questions and try to answer those for you. And I thank you all for your time and your attention.